go in with your eyes open, realize that it's not just good enough to be a good LabVIEW programmer, and the business will roll in.
Welcome to the LabVIEW experiment. I'm your host, Sam Taggart from SAS Workshops. If you're a developer looking to unlock your potential and take your skills to the next level, then look no further. From freeing your imagination and experimenting with new ideas and workflows, to exploring aspects of software development you've never even considered before, I'm going to help you grow your craft so you can approach your work like an artist and have more fun with what you do. In my 15 years working with and training developers, I've helped dozens of individuals and organizations embrace a growth and learning mindset that allows us to overcome challenges and embrace failure as the essential learning experience it is. If you're ready for the philosophies, strategies, tips, and tricks that will unlock your creativity, then it's time to get to work.
All right, so I am here today with Malcolm Meyers of AMH Test Solutions. That's the right name?
Test Systems.
Test Systems, okay. Yeah, I've known Malcolm for 3 or 4 years at least now. So Malcolm is a LabVIEW champion. He runs his own company over in England. And he's very into business and process, and he and I have had a lot of discussions about sales and marketing and all of that. He's actually the author of a video called LabVIEW in 90 Seconds. If you look it up on YouTube, I think that's a very good video. I show that to people all the time who don't know what LabVIEW is.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, well, I don't know if you run into this, but I talk to business people who don't know anything about LabVIEW, and when I say LabVIEW, their eyes glaze over, like I have no idea what you're talking about. So usually it's either that or a negative reaction, like, oh my God, why would you use LabVIEW? Occasionally I get positive ones.
Yeah, I think for people I meet, even coders, people who code in C or Python, you say LabVIEW and their eyes glaze over and you go, this is quite a hard sell sometimes. And that's why I did the introductory video, the 90-second video, just to try and explain it in layman's terms. However, I think I got it the wrong way around. I started off with sort of the technical side and then finished up with these are the business reasons for using LabVIEW. And perhaps I should have done it the other way around. I'm talking to production managers and quality control managers, and you want to be able to test your things. This is LabVIEW, and this is what it can do for you. So, but I've not got round to sort of re-recording it. It's nice to hear that you use it and you show it to people.
Yeah, I liked it. But I'm an engineer, so I feel like when you're doing marketing, you really have to think about your audience. So,
you do.
Which is actually interesting because in coding, you also kind of have to think about your audience as well.
Yeah, you have to. I mean, that's what all user interface is about, isn't it? It's trying to make something complex really quite simple. I mean, it's very easy to nerd out and go, oh, wouldn't it be great to have lots of menu options and lots of things that people can set up? And actually, people don't want that. They just want a big green button, press the big green button, run their test, and pass, fail. Thanks very much. That's all I want. And you've got to hide all your technical wizardry behind something fairly straightforward.
Yeah, that's interesting. We often want to show off how good we are at coding and all this, and usually the end user doesn't really care at all. They typically just want whatever their problem is solved. So
yeah. And I found that with people I always have this conflict of, do I tell people I program in LabVIEW? Because clearly some people know LabVIEW, they go, oh, that's great. And other people just go, I've no idea what you're talking about. Or do I say, no, actually I solve problems and whether I use LabVIEW or anything else is irrelevant. It's the problem I solve that I'm trying to sell. And I've sort of sit on the fence a bit. I said, I solve problems with LabVIEW. So I'm trying to get both sides of the argument, if you like.
Well, I think part of it too depends on your customers and why they come to you and what they're looking for. So like for me, sometimes customers come to me and they don't know anything about LabVIEW, and sometimes they don't even care. They just have a problem they want solved. Sometimes they have an existing LabVIEW solution and whoever their LabVIEW programmer was left, or they hired a contractor and they disappeared. And in those cases, like selling yourself as the LabVIEW expert is actually useful because that's kind of what they're looking for.
Yeah, I found quite a few customers who have had some experience of LabVIEW. They've used it before. Like you say, they've either used someone or someone's left or retired, and they need you to keep their systems going. I've got someone who may become a customer soon who's using software that I think is about 20, 25 years old, LabVIEW software. But the point is it works. And so they've got no intention of changing. They're perfectly happy just buying these old Windows PCs and running it because nothing's on a network. It's all in their building, but it works for them. So it's horses for courses.
Yeah, and they're probably buying parts on eBay and all those things. And that works until it doesn't, and you can't find parts anymore, and then you kind of forced to upgrade.
Mm.
Yeah, I got approached a while ago about upgrading something from like LabVIEW 4 or something. I feel like in recent versions, starting with like 2009 or so, like the upgrade process got a lot better. But going back before that, especially like going back to like pre-DAC MX days, like that's going to require a lot of changes because the old DAC drivers, were you around using those? You know what I'm talking about.
I think the first version of LabVIEW I used was 3.1, and then everything. So error clusters were pink, for example. There's no such thing as an event window or anything like that. It was no undo. And I know I sound like an old man now, but it was I wish I'd been able to use it earlier in a previous job actually. But yes, I do think there comes a point where you go, really, if someone said to me, can you upgrade version 8? I go, yeah, I can program in version 8, but quite frankly, you might as well just start again. All before anything before version 8, just forget it and just start again.
Yeah, that's always an interesting question, though, rewrite versus refactor. I used to be, when I was younger, I was very brash, and I was very much on the side of rewrite. Like, I always wanted to rewrite everything. I'm like, this is garbage. And mostly it was I didn't understand it, more so than it was poorly written, although it was probably poorly written too, but...
Yeah, I've never quite... I've often thought with refactoring is that you look at it, you spend more time trying to figure it out, and then it's trying to shoehorn your way of doing things into someone else's old way of doing things. And most of the time I've just felt I have refactored code with modest results, I think, but I think there's a limit to how much you can refactor. There comes a point with, we want new features, and you go, actually, maybe it's best just to start again.
Well, so I've kind of come full circle on this, and part of it is I feel like as a community, we don't practice refactoring enough, and I feel like if we practiced it, we might reach for it more. It might be like a more sharpened tool in our toolbox. But to me, the refactoring part is about lowering risk.
Yeah.
Because once you start throwing stuff away, you're drastically changing the functionality, whether you intend to or not. And whatever you come up with, there's a saying, something like any feature, anything your code does, whether you intended it to or not, is now a feature, and somebody somewhere is relying on it if enough people actually use your software.
Yeah.
So there is that too.
Yeah, and I think if whatever application is being used in a wide enough area, I knew a company who was using LabVIEW 8.6, and they would not upgrade. Why? Because they had thousands of deployments, and if they had changed, some of those wouldn't work, and they just decided to stick with 8.6. Fair enough, but there comes a point where it's difficult to keep up.
Yeah, there's a lot that's situation dependent. So like most of my machines, there's only 1 or 2 machines, and so upgrading is not really as big a deal in those cases.
Yeah, same here.
Yeah, so most of the projects that you do, are they turnkey solutions where the end customer doesn't know anything about LabVIEW, or is it cleaning up after other people have written some code and left or something?
It's about half and half. Sometimes, 50% of the time, it's here's some code we've got and it does this. Can you add this or add that to it? And you go, okay, I can do that up to a point. But I much prefer it when they just go, there's a blank sheet of paper. This is what we want to achieve. Please go away and do it. Because it means you can settle into what you're comfortable doing and what use your experience more, rather than trying to battle around architectures that may not be particularly well optimized.
Yeah, that is definitely an issue. So then, do you tend to, like your process, do you tend to just take those requirements and then just go away and then come back at the end, or is there some more interaction with the customer?
I've got a project that I prefer to interact on a very regular basis. So, I'll often drop an email just to ask a simple question. How do you want this analyzed? What do you want to do? I would prefer to have a lot more discussion with the client. I'm always conscious that it's very easy to say, well, I think I've got the idea. Go away for 3 months, come back and go, ta-da! And they go, well, that isn't what we wanted. Or their requirements have changed. So I'm hopefully starting a project soon that I would hope would be getting feedback and direction on a weekly basis for what I've done, because I wouldn't want to go much longer than that without showing people the progress. And it's good for them as well, because if they're paying the bills, they like to see something for their money.
It's lower risk for them too, because if there's a problem and there's some disconnect, they can detect it earlier.
Yeah, especially as customers, we all know they don't generally have a fully formed idea of what they want. They may have a general idea, but their requirements change as the project progresses. You may offer them ideas they never thought of, and so it is a good idea. I much prefer to be in very regular contact with clients.
Yeah, I bet that's almost like non-negotiable for me, but I definitely have had several clients that push back about that because sometimes I feel like people view hiring LabVIEW consultants like outsourcing. Like, I've got this problem, I don't want to deal with it, you go deal with it. And those people are generally busy. And then if you tell them, oh, well, we need to meet once a week, they're like, well, I'm too busy. That's why I hired you. But I try to explain to them that they're not going to get the results that they want if they do it that way.
Yeah, I think this client has had a problem before, and so they are asking for weekly updates, and so that suits me fine.
Yeah, it's good as long as it's not like trying to micromanage, right? It's more like collaboration. Yeah, micromanaging does not work very well, like coding with somebody looking over your shoulder. For somebody who's not a coder, right? If you're like pair programming or something like that, that's kind of different. But
even with peer programming, the problem is if you give 6 LabVIEW programmers the same task, they'll probably all tackle it in a slightly different way, or maybe even very different way. And so working with other people, you either have to be on the same page, you have to be using something like, say, DQMH or something that everyone's conversant with. Otherwise, I'm guessing that would make life quite difficult.
yeah, that could be an interesting situation. If you had somebody who like wanted to use Actor Framework and somebody who didn't understand Actor Framework, that would be difficult.
That would.
I'm hoping to try to bring some more people on board so I can do more pair programming. That sounds like a really interesting way to learn for me, to like watch somebody code and see like how they use the IDE and what keyboard shortcuts they use and like how they solve problems. I feel like there's a huge learning opportunity there.
I think that's the disadvantage of working by yourself is there is none of that. And I miss that. If I were part of a bigger team, then you'd get code reviews and people would go, have you thought about doing that? Oh, I do it this way. What about this process? So whilst I take on some processes, for example, Git, I use Git repositories for all my projects, but I use it in a very, very basic form because there's only me. I don't have to branch off for different people, and I don't get any feedback from people. It's just either it works or it doesn't work. So yeah, I do miss that actually. That's one of the disadvantages, I think, of working on your own, which is why I guess you go to places like GDevCon and CLA summits, because you look and you go, maybe you pick up some ideas from other people. And listening to podcasts like this, it's interesting to go, oh, okay, I'd never thought of doing it that way. Maybe I should investigate.
Yeah, that's one of the big goals of this podcast is to get people thinking about other ways of doing things and get them to experiment and try new things. Yeah, I feel like sometimes we're reticent to experiment in the LabVIEW community, which I find kind of odd because LabVIEW grows out of like laboratories where people do experiments all the time. But I feel like there's a certain class of LabVIEW programmers that just aren't really into that experimenting. They're very stuck in the old waterfall way of thinking and doing things.
I think what my problem with that is there's so many things you can do. So let's just take test-driven development, continuous integration, continuous development, all these things. And I believe it was on your podcast, Jim Kring said something about all these things take time. They all, you've all got to put some effort in to get these things working for you. And there's so many of them that you go, I don't know where to start. I don't know which one should I be doing, and it just becomes so confusing. I mean, at one point I went and did the radio frequency course for LabVIEW, and I've done the image acquisition course for LabVIEW, and I've done test stand courses. And you think, great, now I need a project to actually, really learn this stuff properly, and no project comes along. And so what you learn really just withers on the vine. It never becomes ingrained in you. And I sometimes feel that with all these things is it going to be worth my time to put the effort in? And so often I just go, well, I can't really see an immediate benefit, and it's quite a lot of work to get involved. So I just stick to what I know and just experiment in my own way.
Yeah, I mean, they call them programming languages, and the best way to learn a language is to go live somewhere. And so if you learn a programming language by taking a course and then you don't go practice it, that's kind of hard. So, I mean, I'm very much an opportunistic learner, I think. Like, when I see an opportunity on a project to use some new technology, then I go learn about it and try to do it. But I kind of broke that mold recently because I took a Python class just recently last week. Maybe I'll find somebody who will hire me to do some Python work for them. We'll see.
I think that's the thing. I programmed in C many years ago, and I looked at Python, and okay, it's a different syntax, but you go, okay, it's C-like. So I would probably be fine. I learnt the basics, but what I'd really need is someone to say, we've got this data, we want it to look like that. Please process it in LabVIEW, in Python. And then you go, okay, now I know how to. Now I've got actually something to play with and get wrong and try and get right and bug fix, and that's how you learn a new language.
Yeah. Also, as a contractor or like working for yourself, it's hard to do that because you don't want to experiment on client projects as much. There's like this reticentness of like, man, if it's going to take me longer to learn, I'm going to be slower, and yeah, definitely is a bit of that. Whereas I feel like if you work at a big company, it's a little bit less like that.
Yeah, I would think so. So the thing I'm learning at the moment, I think, is SQL. I've decided, at the moment I put stuff into CSV files, and this project I'm doing would produce so much data that actually CSV files would just be overwhelming. You just end up with hundreds of CSV files, which I don't think is a great idea. So I'm keen to get all these results into a database and learn about databases and how to design them and how to fill them and how to pull data out from them.
I've got a good book recommendation for you. There's a book called Practical SQL that is very good.
Right, the one I bought two. One is the Manga Guide to SQL, okay. Which Steve Watts put me onto, and I really do like that. It's explaining things in a very simple way, which I like. And another one, a blue book. I can't remember which one it was. I just picked it up off Amazon, but it's not a terribly well written book. It's got very important words just dropped into the middle of a paragraph. If something is an important word in a language, I like to have it highlighted in some way or have its own section so that it's brought to the front that this is really important. So things like it just dropped in the word entity, as if somehow you'd know what's an entity in a database. I don't know. I know what an entity is generally, but what language for programming is very specific. So I wasn't so happy with that. But the Manga book is a great starter, and I've just got to explains databases and the way they work very well. But it's now I've got the challenge of actually getting LabVIEW to work with databases, so I'm working on that.
Cool. I will give you another recommendation that I've started doing lately. SQLite has the SQLite database browser, and it's like a GUI application. And what I do is I download like statistics from my blog, or like I'll go into my accounting software and download stuff, and you download this big CSV file, and it has a method in the GUI to import it into a table. And then you can just run a bunch of queries on it. And so it's a good way to practice like writing queries and stuff. Because it's got like its own little window where you type in the query, you hit enter, it spits out a table. And it's even got some very, very basic like plotting. So like you can do like, your cash flow over the past couple months and like figure out how to calculate that from all the transactions and then plot it. And SQL is also something where I feel like you need to have a reason to do it. Like, you could go through all the examples, but when they don't really mean anything to you, you just sound like,
Yeah, I mean, the Manga one is selling fruit to foreign countries. Well, I don't sell fruit and I don't export. So it's not really terribly relevant, but it's a nice, simple example to start with.
But database, statistics for my blog, I care about those, and I want to know, like, is my traffic going up or down, and like, can I correlate that with when I make posts and things like that, or like business stuff, how many clients have I gotten, every month for the past X number of years or whatever. Yeah, I think there's a lot of value to be had in those type of data analytics, and I think that's part of what NI is trying to pursue with the whole system link thing, is trying to get businesses to take advantage of all that. I know when I worked at Westinghouse, we tested circuit boards, and they would go to these nuclear power plants and test the circuit boards every year, and they had like 10, 15 years worth of data, and they never mined it for anything, which just seemed like a terrible waste to me, because they could have done, like this circuit board, we measured this voltage, and over the years it slowly declined, and then it eventually failed. Well, if we see another circuit board that's on the same path, we can replace it before it fails and not have the plant go down. Like, that's huge value. And
I know.
File the data, so.
Yeah, I had a client, an automotive client. They said, "Oh, here, look at this big USB hard drive. It's 10 terabytes." I went, "Oh, wow, that's a lot of data." But yeah, it's all full of data, and we've never looked at it. And you go, well, what was the point then? What's the point in having all 10 terabytes of data that you actually don't really get any useful information from? That seems a terrible waste.
Yeah, I had somebody say once, I think it was like, data is cheap, insights are difficult. So like taking that data and actually like taking the time to sift through it and see the important trends. And yeah, I feel like if you were a LabVIEW programmer who could also offer that, I feel like that would be a big, because part of the problem with a lot of our stuff is selling it to the business people. Because the engineers know that, like, yeah, automating this is the way to go and it's going to be so much better. But the business people sometimes are reluctant. But if you can like make the case that like, hey, we can do predictive maintenance or whatever, we can predict when these things are going to fail long before they fail so that it's not a surprise and you're not losing money. You can schedule your downtime, and there's a lot of value in that.
I think that's what I've come around to with proposals is it's very easy to, in your proposal, to nerd out and go, wow, we're going to have 16 channels of AI and 32 channels of digital output. And it's going to do, technically, it's going to do this, it's going to do that. But actually, like you say, the engineers quite like that, but the people at the top don't really care. What they want to know is what's the business benefit. And this project that I'm hoping to get soon, I look at it and I go, I reckon a quarter of this is LabVIEW. Now, it will all be done in LabVIEW, but what I mean by that is a quarter of it is getting raw data from sensors and packaging it up in some way. The big sell, and I've tried to put this in the proposal, is that this will provide, this is why I'm going to the database idea, this will provide a database of information that you can query. So you're going to have, they've got something that they want to sell around the world. You could draw in data from around the world, produce automated reports, come in on a Monday morning, hit the button and produce an automated report, and that will show you how well your product is doing against the competition, and you can use that to sell your product. So it's all aimed at trying to say this will positively impact your bottom line. This will positively impact the income to your company. And I just happen to be using LabVIEW to do that.
Yeah, I also, as you were talking, I was thinking of another use case too. Like we were talking about like selling services, like after you, like say you sell a test system to somebody selling a service, like part of it could be maintenance of the system, but the other part could be data mining and reporting. And we will take a look at the data every couple months and we'll run some reports for you and we'll look for anomalies and figure out what's going on.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing is, and this is what I've realized, I think, in business is it's one thing to convince the engineers that what you're doing is worthwhile. But I think it's a step up if you can convince investors or chief financial officers or, the chief accountant of the company that what you're doing is going to benefit their company. It will either make things quicker for them or slicker for them or provide a revenue stream for them. That's much more important than which NI, which C-series module you happen to be using or which C-Rio chassis you're going to use.
Yeah, I mean, that's very important. You're talking money, but the other thing too to talk about is risk. Think about how doing certain development practices lowers the risk, which ultimately translates into money, but
that's
just another, it's another avenue to get at the money side of it.
Yeah. But it's the difficulty, I think, is if we are LabVIEW programmers, is it's getting to those people, getting to the people who sign the big checks, because generally you're talking to other engineers in the company, aren't you? You're not generally talking to the managing director. And it's quite a challenge to get to speak to people at the top, I think, sometimes.
Yeah, that definitely is a challenge. I face that a lot. Part of it, I think, too, though, is a double-pronged approach does help because, like, say you convince the manager to hire you. If he goes to the engineers and he says, hey, we're hiring this person, he's going to come in and tell you guys what to do, right, which is not the way to do it to begin with. But if he does that, if they don't know who you are, they're like, oh, they're going to resent it. But if they're like, oh yeah, I've read this guy's blog post and I've seen him podcast or whatever, and this guy knows what he's talking about, then they're excited to have you there. Yeah. That's a much better approach.
Mm. And I think that even in a more general terms, I think that's why having the LabVIEW certifications is helpful, because it just says, I'm a certified LabVIEW developer, or I'm a certified LabVIEW architect. At least I've met some level of competence. I know the basic, structures and architectures that people recommend in LabVIEW, so I should be able to do a competent job. And I think that's really important because I've run 2 LabVIEW businesses, one without certification and one with. And I think the one with, which is the one I'm running now, is more successful as a result, because you're able to pin something and go, actually, I am competent, and here I've actually passed some exams to prove my competence.
Yeah, that's an interesting topic. I'm not sure how I feel about that. Certifications are definitely, like, in absence of anything else, a certification is a good sign that, like, you're on the right track. Yeah.
Go on, fight me on this. Fight me on this. Go
Oh,
on.
no. Yeah, I mean, the knowledge that you gain to pass the certification, in my mind, is more important than the piece of paper. That's part of my thinking. Like the ultimate, as Steve would probably say, is like having customers who you've done work for vouch for you. So if you can get like a referral from a customer that says, hey, Sam or Malcolm did this work for me and they did a really good job. In my mind, if I was hiring people, that would count almost more for me than a certification.
And I'd agree with both of those points. I think obviously I did some training. I did LabVIEW Core 3 and a few other courses. But actually just forcing myself to sit down and try and code for 4 hours to make something work taught me quite a lot. And so I learned a lot just by putting myself forward for the CLD and the CLA exams. And I do agree, anyone who can give you a recommendation or point you to someone or introduce you to someone and say, this person has done a really good job for us, I think is extremely valuable. Like you say, the CLA and the CLD or the alliance partner is great if you've got nothing else to go on. But certainly a personal referral, I think, is the gold standard.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough, right? If you're looking to hire a LabVIEW programmer and you've got 2 choices and you don't know anything about either of them, but one has the certification, you're probably going to go with the one with the certification. Yeah, yep. It's kind of a no-brainer in that situation. But I mean, I'm sure listeners will agree, like, and maybe you'll agree, like, I've known people who are CLAs who are not very great programmers, and I know people who are not CLAs who are really good, competent programmers. I think in the industry, I think it's a problem because people who have a job in industry aren't necessarily motivated to get certified. There's a lot of people in industry who are very, very good, but have never gotten certified because their company doesn't value it.
Again, I would agree with that. I think it shows, there's always the thing of someone saying, oh, I knew someone who just did a couple of courses and got their CLA. And no system is perfect.
Yeah.
It can only show you so much. If you're going to interview someone, if you're going to hire someone for a job and all you do is go, oh, they're a CLA, that's good enough, then that's probably not the best way to hire people. Certainly CLA should be part of the mix, but you'd at least want to know what sort of projects have they worked on. Have they got any referrals they could give you? And certainly I've met someone quite recently actually, who I think is a very good programmer, but just hasn't got round to doing the exams because he's just not needed to.
Yeah, well, I think that's actually an interesting conversation to have for the people in the audience who might be looking to hire somebody. Like, how do you evaluate somebody's competence aside from the certificate, right? It's like, say you have 2 CLAs and they're both CLAs, like,
or even if you've got someone who's not got, you have 2 people and one's a CLA and one isn't, but you've got a great referral from them.
Yeah,
someone which one do you go for? But that's an interview process, isn't it? That's up to the hirer to ask pertinent questions and to make their judgment.
Yeah, well, I think too that plays into that is like relevant experience. Like, do they have experience in a similar industry and also on similar projects? Like you could be a CLA and have only ever worked on tiny, small projects, small, medium-sized projects. You might not be a great candidate for a big, huge project, even if you're, a completely competent programmer. If that's not if you've always worked by yourself and now you're getting thrown into a team on a large project with a bunch of moving parts, that might not be a good fit.
Well, I think also LabVIEW is used in many ways. You can become a CLA and never have programmed FPGA, for instance. And someone say, oh, I want a LabVIEW FPGA project. And you may be a CLA, but that doesn't mean you're the right person for that job, because if you've never done FPGA, it's a specialist skill. it's a specialist subset, or image acquisition, or any of the many things that LabVIEW is capable of, or test stand. There's so many spheres of expertise within the NI world that one certificate can't. It isn't a one size fits all certificate. It's only a level of competence and a level of experience.
That is very true. I can speak from experience. When I worked at Westinghouse, they gave me a LabVIEW RT project running in a CREO, and I tried to program it like I was programming on Windows, and it failed miserably. Eventually, we figured it out, but I actually got a free trip to Austin out of that because it was something where our project, I just learned object-oriented programming, and so I had like this big God object that I was passing around a shift register that had a bunch of other objects inside it. And so basically, it was like this big giant thing. And when you deployed a CVO, there was some limit on like, as it deploys, it builds some stack. And I set some arbitrary limit, like, 64 kilobytes or whatever it was. They're like, nobody will ever deploy a project bigger than that. And we tried to deploy one that was much bigger. But the limit was just like arbitrary. So for that particular project, we were buying like a bunch of hardware from them. And so they were willing to help us. And so I got a free trip on there and learned what not to do, which is almost as important as learning what to do. So, yeah. So, Malcolm, do you have any experience with things not turning out the way you thought they were?
Yeah, so two things. My two experiments, one is unintentional. Many years ago, I got made redundant, and I thought, I knew LabVIEW, and I'd learned it myself or in companies with other people, but never actually done any of the sort of regular training courses. And so I started my own LabVIEW company, and I just thought, I know LabVIEW, I'll tell a few people and I'll get some work. And it didn't really work out. I got some work, but not much. Eventually I gave that up and went and worked with some other people. And then when I stopped working with them, I'd had a friend who'd become a hypnotherapist, of all things. And he'd gone on a course, and a dozen people on his course, and they'd all gone into business. And 2 years later, he was the only one left in business. And I wondered why that was. And the thing was, his background had been sales. He'd been a salesman before a hypnotherapist. And it made me go, actually, if you're going to be in business, it's not just good enough to be technically good. You actually do need to be certified and be a salesman or a marketer or all these other things. You need all these other skills to run a business. And so the second LabVIEW company, I thought, well, first of all, I'll get myself certified. I'll do the training courses. I'll get myself certified, but I must learn how to run a business. And so I've been better at it. I wouldn't say I'm super successful. There are other companies out there and names I could name who are much more successful than I am, but it's kept a roof over my head for 10 years. So I must be doing something right. So that was my first experiment, unintentional. The second one is, a lot of people just use LabVIEW, don't they? They program a CREO chassis or a compact DAC equipment. There's your test system, off you go. But some people, especially the bigger companies, start getting into making whole systems. You make the chassis and you add in DIN rail and you add in other components and you make a whole. And so LabVIEW becomes a smaller part of the overall project, but you end up with a huge rack of equipment. And I thought I would have a go at that. I had the opportunity to do that quite recently. And unfortunately, the NI equipment was all on very long lead times. We wanted about 30 channels of data acquisition, and all the NI stuff was on like 6 months to a year long lead times. And so we said, well, let's get a DVM and a relay board we can program in LabVIEW and put it in a box and just switch 30 channels that way. And that proved much harder than I had anticipated. And it's much harder to debug because with the NI equipment, if you've got a 30 channel, you've got 30 channel scope, basically. You can look at all the channels simultaneously, do stats on them all in parallel. You can't do that if you're doing one channel at a time. So that proved very hard. I think the other thing with making whole systems is all of a sudden I needed reels of cable. So I needed reels of cable in all the different colors, and I needed tools, and I needed connectors, and I needed backup stuff. So instead of just being, I've got a laptop and I'm good to go, now my office is full of crates of tools and crimp tools and crimps and all sorts of stuff. And it made me go, actually, it's quite a big investment to get into building big systems. So whilst I would do it again, I would only do it with NI equipment. I'd only do, and I'm not trying to be a salesman for NI, but their stuff works. We all know it. And I think going third party is a bit of a slippery slope. But yes, I think you have to be a bit careful deciding to make a jump to making big systems, because it's quite a big commitment in terms of the amount of effort you need to put in and the amount of stuff you need. So those are my two experiments. I think if you're going to be in business, you need to be certified and you need to do the training and you need to learn how to run a business. And if you're going to go into bigger systems, you need to go in with open eyes. You need to realize that actually it's quite a big commitment, quite a big jump to make from just writing LabVIEW code.
Yeah, I agree. I've always thought that if I got one of those projects, I would just partner with somebody else who does the mechanical stuff.
And I think that's another way to do it is, and I think I would now as well. I would look around and go, right, who makes boxes? Who does wiring? Who does wiring looms? And I would partner up as well. I agree, because generally those people have the space to do it. I was doing it in my office at home, and all of a sudden I was just overwhelmed with stuff, with hardware, and it was quite it was much harder than I thought it would be.
Yeah, well, that's one of the traps I think as business owners we tend to fall into, is we want to do everything ourselves. So that's a very important lesson to learn, is like, yes, things have to get done, but that doesn't mean you have to do them.
Yeah, and I think it was partly, I'm an electronic, I trained as an electronics engineer. I wired things up before. Yeah, I'll be fine. So I had some experience, but it just, all in all, it made me go, actually, I made life hard for myself. I got it working in the end, and it is working, but I think certainly I would have, had it been, even if it had just been done with NI hardware, it would have been a lot easier.
I'm also an electrical engineer, and I have a workbench at home with power supplies and soldering irons and stuff. And in the past couple of years, I've barely touched any of them. I keep having this idea that I'll get back into doing more hardware, and then I'm just like, yeah. It's like, it's one of those things where like you need to pick your specialty and pick what you're strong at. And I'm much better at writing software than doing hardware stuff. So it's and I have the bigger impact, and where can I make more money too? That's also
And I think the other thing is, and I met a guy who was essentially doing what we're doing with electronics. And I think he came across the same problem, is that most LabVIEW, like you said, most LabVIEW coding you do is for one or two items. And then you go to the next job and it's completely different. Okay, you use similar architecture, you use similar code. But I don't think there are many people who've managed to say, I've made a LabVIEW system and I've sold it 1,000 times. It's not like, and this guy making the electronics had the same problem. He was doing bespoke electronics for people. So every job was a brand new job. And I've always felt, the holy grail, I think, would be to find something, a tester of some description that you could use with LabVIEW and sell 100 or sell 1,000 or even, sell just high quality, a high expense things. And I've never had the idea. So then that I think would be an interesting one. But then you give yourself other challenges. Is once you've made it, then you've got to market it and you've got to sell it and you've got to. So I don't think
support it.
Yeah, and support it and be around, stay in business long enough to offer guarantees and all that sort of stuff. So it might solve one set of problems, but I'm sure it would generate its own set of challenges for you to do that.
Yeah, I've also had that idea in the back of my head, like some sort of product. Because I do feel like offering services is great, but like you said, like there's no regularity to it sometimes. And so like having a product, I feel like offers a lot of advantage. But as you said, there is the other side of it too. And you have to ship it and you have to warehouse it and have stock and all these things. Yeah.
I think the thing is, I've come across people who, so I met someone the other day through one of my networking groups who just makes aluminium windows. And he started in 2017 and started making aluminium windows, and he takes on staff and he's making a profit and his company is expanding. And you go, that's because I guess he's got more of a consumer product. It's much more a generic product that lots of people would want. I'd find it hard to think of a product that you could make with LabVIEW that lots of people would want. You know, I can't think. You know, you're not going to make say a central heated control system with LabVIEW, because you can buy them for a couple of £100 off the shelf. You know, you're never going to be able to make something in LabVIEW that's cheaper or more cost effective. Maybe there are people out there who've got that product in mind and are able to do it. And all power to them. I think it'd be wonderful to do that. But yeah, I've never quite had the idea.
Well, I think too, LabVIEW's geared more towards prototyping, and yeah, it's not really geared towards that like mass production side.
No. The only time it is when you're making a test system at the end of someone's production line. But again, the only thing you could do is go, well, I know, you know, maybe there are 2 other companies making this same thing that you're testing. Maybe I could go and sell it to them, but it's never going to be a consumer product, I don't think.
Yeah, and then also I've had the ideas like selling software tools to LabVIEW developers, but selling tools to developers in general is hard. And then LabVIEW developers, you've like made the pool much smaller.
But there clearly are people who manage it, or I mean, I don't know if they make money off them, but they're, you know, obviously there's package manager and people do put these packages up. I appreciate a lot of the time it's sort of open source or sort of, you know, what is it, BSD license or whatever. I can't remember the name of the license, where basically you're giving it away for free.
I've kind of come to the conclusion that making tools for the LabVIEW community, if you're a consultant, you're better off using it for marketing than you are trying to charge for it, for the most part. I mean, there's probably a few exceptions to that, but yeah.
Yeah, I don't know many people who've made lots of money off of marketing LabVIEW tools. I mean, it's a bit like going to a CLA summit and hoping to get business. Hey, I'm a CLA. Oh, you're all CLAs as well. Oh, well, you know, you might get some partnerships. You know, maybe they'll go, oh, hang on, if we get a project that's a bit too much for our company, maybe we'll hire you and, you know, borrow you for a few weeks to help us out. But that's the best you can hope for.
Yeah, my case study of all of that is JKI, because like they put out like their state machine and all this stuff, and like they're fairly well known. Everybody in the LabVIEW community knows who they are. So like that's like if they had charged for it, would they be as well known as they are? And I don't know, but I have to think that being as well known as they are, that has to lead to business.
I certainly think that. I mean, I only met Jim Kring once, I think. But clearly he's extremely successful. Now, whether he puts that down to being a brilliant LabVIEW programmer or a much better businessman than the rest of us, or a mixture of both, I don't know. I'd be interested to hear his point of view. But certainly, yeah, he's easily one of the leading people in the LabVIEW community.
Although they do have that VIPM, which they were charging for the pro version. And I don't know the financials of that, like how much money they actually make on that, but the fact that they are able to charge, I think they're charging like, you know, a couple $100 for it, and people were paying for it. And then, as you mentioned, there are 1 or 2 other tools I know of where people are charging for LabVIEW stuff, but it seems to be pretty rare.
I think it's the exception rather than the rule.
Yeah.
And you know, either by thoughtfulness or by luck, people get that tool and they market it properly and they get it. Good, like I say, good luck to them. I admire anyone who can find a product and make it work and earn money from it. That's the ideal of being a business. And if they do it well, brilliant. I take my hat off to them.
Well, I think selling tools to developers is hard because developers kind of have this mindset of we'll do it ourselves, and they have a very specific idea of what they want. And if your tool doesn't do exactly what they want, they'll just find a way around it, and they'll write their own tool for it. And then it's like, well, why should I pay for yours?
Yeah.
And so then you end up with a tool that's less useful because you're trying to do everything for everybody. And yeah.
It's like there's a cartoon. Is it XCD? XKCD. The idea that, well, there's two connectors on the market. So what we really need is a unified connector. Let's have one standard connector. So they make the one standard connector. There it is, and actually you end up with 3 standard connectors then. You know, USB clearly is a bit different. You know, that actually is universal. But even then, I guess people with Macs and Apple would go, well, I use Firewire, or I use whatever they're using now.
So USB is not as universal as you think, because you pick up a USB-C cable, and it could be a USB-C power only. It could be USB-C with DisplayPort. It could be USB-C. USB-C 3.1, FireWire 3, FireWire 4, and they all look the same, and it's kind of crazy.
Yeah.
I just discovered that the other day. I plugged something, I'm like, why isn't this working? I was like, I tried a different cable, and all of a sudden it worked. I was like,
Yeah.
but they can't even standardize on the connectors either, so that's a whole other.
No.
So why would they standardize on the actual functionality? Any last minute closing thoughts?
I guess just to say to anyone who's thinking about going into business, go in with your eyes open. Realize that it's not just good enough to be a good LabVIEW programmer, and the business will roll in it. You might get lucky, of course, but if you're going to be consistent long term, you need to learn how to run a business as well, and you need to pay as much attention to running a business as you do to improving your LabVIEW coding. I would say that the people I know who are successful, I look at them and go, they're running a business. That it just happens to be a LabVIEW business. But I suspect if you gave them a business running, hat makers or I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but they have those business skills, and that's really important if you can be long-term successful.
Yeah, to that I would add that if you just want to write LabVIEW code, running your own business is probably not the way to go about it.
No. If you're happy doing 9 to 5 and you're getting reasonably well paid, and you've got you like your co-workers, and you like the company you work for, and all they give you is LabVIEW projects, then stick to it. Just stick to that. But there is one thing I would add, and I think it's interesting. Steve Watts says this, is I think you can still be active within a company. You can be passive in the sense of your boss gives you a job, you go and do it, and you wait for the next job. That's passive. But I don't think you'll get on in your company doing that. I think if you go around your company and go, there's a problem there, I could solve that with LabVIEW, I'm going to tell that manager that I can solve their problem with LabVIEW, then I think that's an active way of improving your LabVIEW skills and your professional, your career within a company structure. That you actually go around looking for problems to solve within your company, and you actually advertise yourself as a problem solver. I think that's better than just sitting there waiting for jobs to come your way because someone up the chain thinks you might be able to do it.
Well, that's actually very good prep for starting your own business, because trying to find opportunities and then sell yourself into them, that's very much a business owner type thinking.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
It is.
Very cool. Well, thank you very much, Malcolm. It's been great.
Thank you.
That's it for today's episode of the LabVIEW Experiment. Thanks for listening. If you have any comments or questions, head over to thelabviewexperiment.com and drop me a note. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Instagram at @TheLVExperiment so you never miss an episode. And remember, small steps and quick feedback are all you need. Catch you next time.